Welcome to good evening, everyone, and welcome to an online ITA event. And today we have guest speakers, Mr. Peter Biddlecombe, and he's the editor of the Sunday Times Crossword puzzle, and is here to tell us about how cryptic clues work.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm going to change plans slightly because I think we're going to be short of time. So I'm going to save the comments about World War II and crosswords for the end, if that's okay. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about me. I was born in 1960, had a fairly ordinary London suburban life. Went to university, came out and started out work as a trainee actuary. That's a life insurance statistician, but didn't make it as one of those and switched to working in computing, which I did for about the next 20 years and up until about 2008. And I was made redundant from a computing job in 2008 and got the Sunday Times Crossword editing job at the beginning of 2011. So I've been doing it nearly 10 years. Outside of work, which is now Crosswords, the other interests that I've had in my life, apart from obvious stuff like reading, is long distance running. I used to do cross country and road races, and classical music, including playing the trombone, which I learned to play at school. So that's a brief bit about me. And then as far as crosswords go, my interest started when I was about 13. I used to get, for about a year at that age, I got a monthly puzzle magazine, which was in those days mostly crosswords because no one had thought of Sudoku yet. And there were quite easy crosswords, not cryptic, and mostly in the magazine. But there was one puzzle in the magazine that they called the full-blooded cryptic crossword. And I got absolutely nowhere with that. Then after that, there was a pause for a year or two while I studied for my first serious exams. I restarted and picked up cryptics in the summer of 1976. We were on holiday in an English seaside town, and there was a second-hand bookshop close to the seafront, and I found a pan book of cryptic crosswords in there, and the crosswords in the book were graded. So there were some easy ones at the beginning, which turn out, looking back now, to be very, very easy, and slightly harder ones towards the end. And I looked at those puzzles and I started to work out a bit of what was going on. Then in 1977, when I was doing my A-levels, that's university exams, or exams to get into university, I started buying the Times on a student offer and optimistically attempted to do their cryptic crossword, not knowing that it was the hardest in a daily paper in the country. And on most days, I got somewhere between 2 and 6 answers out of 30. So that was a bit of a struggle. Then I stopped again while I did my A-level exams and restarted at university. University was London School of Economics, which was in its sort of socialist era, or the students thought it was. The economics teachers were actually all very conservative, but among the students, I didn't see many people reading the Times. They all read the Guardian. So I bought the Guardian and tried their crossword, which was quite a bit easier, and started to make some progress. And I can't remember exactly, but I think I was finishing maybe 2 of those puzzles every week by 1981 when I left university. So after I started work, I kept on solving mostly on public transport on the way to work, and gradually got better. I restarted the Times crosswords in 1983, and I didn't know at the time, but that coincided with the change of crossword editor at the paper, and he eased up the difficulty a bit. Then 1987, I got a new book that had come out about cryptic crosswords, which explained the kind of logic that I'm going to explain to you. And suddenly everything made sense and they were much easier. So in 1989, I had my first go at the Times Crossword Championship, where you compete by solving against the clock and have to solve puzzles in about 10 minutes to be close to the top. And at the time, they had regional finals followed by a national final. So I turned up with about 250 other people at a London regional final. And I was 33rd out of the 250, which was nowhere near getting into the national final, which was the top 5, but it was better than I expected. So I kept going back. And in 1992, I reached my first national final, which is the top 20 to 24 people in the contest. 1992, I also met the lady who I'm now married to. And in 1993 and the following 2 years, I had the extra pleasure of showing my highly developed crossword skills by impressing her at the championship regional finals. And 3 years in a row, I messed them up a bit and didn't make the national final until 1996, when I got back into it. And after that, I qualified for the final stage every year until I stopped competing when I got this job. A few years later than that, after that, in 2000, I got my first win in the championship, beating a man called Mark Goodliff, who these days wins the championship practically every single year. I think he's won something like 10 out of the last 11. But at that stage, he hadn't quite got his system worked out as precise as it is now, so he was still beatable. After that, there was a 5-year gap because the generosity of various sponsors ran out, so the competition just wasn't held. In that interval of time, in that gap, I started a cryptic crossword blog about Times and later Sunday Times Crosswords, where I would solve the crossword and I would tell people how long I'd taken to solve it to give them an idea of how difficult it was. And I started out just explaining maybe half a dozen of the hardest clues, or the ones that were, I thought, interesting. As the audience grew, I wrote about more and more clues and ended up explaining all but about 1 or 2. But that ended up taking a lot of time. So a year later, roughly, I converted the blog into a team effort, and that's now, and at the same time, other blogs started for the other serious crosswords in daily papers. And that's the blogging system that we've still got, although now I'm no longer involved in it. And then in 2008, I had a brief brush with brain cancer. I had a brain tumor diagnosed and then treated successfully, fortunately. And crumbs, either at the end of 2008 or maybe the beginning of 2009, I was made redundant by the computer firm that I was working for, and I was out of work for a while. Sometime in the summer of 2010, I was in touch with the people who ran the website where you could do Times and Sunday Times Crosswords, and I was passing on feedback about their system for doing it, using my computing experience. And at some stage in that summer, the lady who was running the Crossword Club, as it was called then, told me that they were developing a new version. And she said, I wish we could get you to test this, but I can't see how we can get you through all the security firewalls so that you can see it from where you are. And I said to her, well, hang on a minute, I'm redundant at the moment. I've got plenty of time and I know where your offices are. So if you're happy to buy me lunch and pay my train fare, I'll come into London and do a day's testing for you. She said, oh, yes, please. Right. So I went in, did the day's testing. And a few days after that, I get this email that says, "Thanks very much for all your help. Was really useful." Mentioned some other things. And at the end, she said, "I thought you might be interested to know that Barbara Hall, the Sunday Times Crossword editor, is retiring at the end of the year." And I thought, maybe I can do that job. So I asked who to apply to and put my hat in the ring. And after waiting, you have to wait a while for newspapers to take action. Then she was retiring at the end of the year, and I'd heard about this roughly July. And there were lots and lots of delays. And the bloke I was writing, I'd sent my details to, I would phone him or email him about once a month and just check that they were still interested in me. And he'd say, "Yes, don't worry, Peter, it's all fine, we'll be on to you later." So it was the 10th of December, I think, that they called me up and said, "Can you come in on Friday for an interview?" No, the 10th of December was when I had the interview, which was a Friday. And it obviously went well enough for me to get the job, although they didn't tell me at the interview. And I started on the Tuesday after that and had a very brief handover period with this lady, Barbara Hall, who was retiring at the age of 87, but was a very sharp lady, and gave me a few good bits of advice. And then I was off on my own. And I've been doing the job ever since. So, just to briefly tell you what the job involves, the main tasks are, from time to time, choosing somebody new to write crosswords for us. I've had one person die while I was in the job after only a few months, which is quite dramatic, and a couple of other people who've decided to go off and do something else. So you have to find a way of finding possible candidates and trying them out. Then the main task on a weekly basis is receiving crosswords from the people who write them, because I only write one. I write one of our crosswords, and I write that crossword every 6 weeks, and that's it for the Sunday Times. I do one other puzzle for the Times Literary Supplement, but I'm mostly editing. So I receive other people's puzzles, and I solve them as they've sent them to me. And then I do a vast amount of checking and rechecking of how the logic works and are the facts right, and come up with a list of changes that I think are required. And depending on the setter involved, I either suggest my ideas, or, knowing that they're unlikely to accept my ideas, just say new clue wanted or change wanted, and we agree on the final version. And then, because the Sunday Times is only a weekly paper, although we've got 4 different crosswords, that's only 4 crosswords a week. If I was editing for the Times, I'd be doing about a dozen crosswords a week. So to make up for that difference, I do a lot more of the production side. The Times Crossword editor basically supplies production staff with a copy of the puzzle, and they put it on the page. I think they send him a proof and he checks the proof. For me, I just take the final version of the puzzle that I've produced from my discussion with the setter, and I put that on the printed page and do all the checking of the printed page. That's one way of making up the apparently spare time. I also deal with any correspondence about the crosswords. And one thing that's unique to the Sunday Times as a weekly paper is that we have a clue writing contest where I choose a word each week, and the people who want to write their own cryptic clue for this word and send them in by email. And I choose each week the cryptic clue, their clue that I think is best. Other things that happen, about maybe every 2 years, I actually get to write something for the paper about crosswords that isn't a crossword, and might do things like radio interviews. Starting fairly soon, I'm going to have a brief spot about once a month on a radio station called Times Radio, which we've just started. And one of the guys who presents a show there is keen to learn about cryptic crosswords. And I also do some book editing. Currently, we produce 2 books every year of Sunday Times Crosswords of some kind, and I basically collect the copy that we've got from the past and look at them all again and check for any mistakes or anything that needs changing because of difference, because they were 8 or 10 years ago, and get those proof checked and so on. So that's the job. I'm going to take I'm going to share my screen now, and just to make sure that you understand the difference with cryptic crosswords, I'm going to show you briefly some crosswords that aren't cryptic. That's Brie. Yes. Okay, so this is the big window you can see on my screen is the Times Crossword Club site, and we have a section of cryptic crosswords, and we've got a section here called concise crosswords, and we'll have a quick look at a concise. This means a concise crossword here means one that isn't cryptic, it's just plain definitions. So we've got, in this clue, the first clue here, we've got writing fluid, which must be ink, and we've got violations of a law, can't think of that one. We've got telephone booth at 5 down, which must be kiosk, and so on. So those are, I'm assuming, the kind of crosswords that you would get in Israel, which just have mostly straightforward definitions of the answer. We've also got what we call a general knowledge crossword. And here's the latest example. This is, I don't know whether you have quiz nights in Israel. Very popular social activity in the UK, or it was before lockdown, where you just have teams of people answering general knowledge questions. And this is quiz night meets crossword. So here we've got general knowledge questions. So we've got Lily the Pink was a 1968 hit for the blank. And if you're old enough to remember the song, then it's The Scaffold. And then you've got the comic actor here, who happens to be Charlie Chaplin, and so on. So that's your non-cryptic crosswords. And so now I'm going to tell you how cryptic crosswords differ with a PowerPoint presentation. So there's cryptic crosswords and how the clues work. Pretty much reading from the slides here because I want to just get this part done fairly quickly so that we've got time for actually seeing a real crossword being solved, because it struck me, you know, I could talk for easily an hour about how the clues work, but that's kind of a bit like describing how people play football without showing you any football. So the idea here is to get through this bit as fast as I can and then show you an actual crossword where we'll see real examples and how they might be solved. So every cryptic clue should have 3 things. The first thing it should have, that we ought to remember at this point, because we're going to talk about an awful lot about logic, but that's not the whole thing about cryptic crosswords. There is a sort of artistic impression side, which is all about the fact that your crossword clue should look like a convincing bit of language. So it might appear to be, it might look like an imitation of one of the non-cryptic clues that you've just seen, or it might look like a short phrase or a statement or a very short story. Then the next thing it must have is a definition. So in a non-cryptic crossword, the definition is all you get. So you might get fish, brackets, 5, close brackets, and your answer could be shark or trout or probably a few dozen other fish. And in a cryptic clue, you're going to get a definition, but it might not be as simple as one word. And finally, we must have some logic. So as well as the definition, there's got to be something else in the clue, which is usually words that are not the definition. And those words give you a good reason for choosing a particular answer, like which of the fish choices, or if you've guessed an answer from what you think is the definition, which is very often how you solve the clues, you've then used the logic side of it to say, does that possible answer actually work? If it doesn't, try another one until you get to one where you can make the logic make sense for your answer, for your proposed answer. Okay, so starting from a plain definition and adding something else, there are basically three ways to do that. The first way is the oldest way, and this kind gets called cryptic definition. And this is a very old example. This was probably first seen in the Times Crossword sometime in the 1930s. Times Crossword started in 1930. And it appears to say a wicked thing. But, and the answer is candle. And you think, well, candles aren't wicked. But what's going on here is that we have to remember that crosswords operate in print. So you don't hear the clue, you read it. And if you see a verb ending in ed in English, it can mean something that's equipped with the thing before the ed. So if you're equipped, you've got equipment, for instance. That's a slightly cheating version, but it's that kind of reasoning. So the crossword setter's idea long ago was that wicked could mean having a wick, and a wick is part of a candle. So the candle is not a wicked thing, it's a wicked thing. And that's our first example. We'll see lots more of a word in the clue not meaning what it looks as if it means. Okay, so then we've got a newer version of this. This one says, in which we see crates stacked up by the tower. And that's 7,7, which means it's two words, those 7 letters. And the answer is holding pattern. And a holding pattern in aviation is the stack of planes that are about to land at an airport or waiting to land. About to is probably an exaggeration. You might be up there half an hour. And the reason that works is that crate is an old slang term for an aeroplane, because lots of them were made of wood, like crates. And the pattern that they're put in resembles a stack, so it's called a stack. And that stack is set up by the airport's control tower. So that's why it's crates stacked up by the tower, which sounds like a delivery to a castle or something like that, is actually about an airport. And that clue won the prize in our clue writing contest maybe 7 years ago. And it was written by somebody who now writes some of the Sunday Times Cryptic Crosswords. And another person who used to compete in that contest is also on the team now and actually wrote the puzzle that we're going to solve as an example. So that's the first way to make a definition, to add something to a definition to create a cryptic clue. The next way to add to a definition is put in another definition. Okay, so you can have a clue that just consists of 2 different definitions for the same word, or you don't have to stop at 2. You can have 3 or 4. I think people have gone up to 6 or 7 for a few words. So here are a couple of examples. First one that says ice bank with 7 letters. And this is nothing to do with the Arctic or the Antarctic. The answer is reserve. And reserve in social terms is the ice, as people call it, that you break at parties when you start the party. And a bank, as in blood bank, is a reserve, meaning a stock of things that you're keeping ready to use. But put the two together, and you're not suggesting the reserve at parties, and you're not suggesting that kind of bank. Oh, sorry, that kind of reserve, rather. Second one is a cheeky clue that just says, exceptional clue, which you have to laugh at. The setters in our puzzles, we print their name next to the puzzle. So whoever wrote this is saying, here's an exceptional clue. And in its way, it is an exceptional clue. So we need a word, and this is another double definition. So we need a word that matches a clue as a hint to something, and also matches exceptional. And with an older meaning of this word, the word is signal. And in the second meaning, the exceptional meaning, that meaning exists for signal, but it's old-fashioned. And when I was researching this, I looked up the Oxford English Dictionary, the big one with 13 volumes or whatever it is in print. And I found this nice little quotation to illustrate the meaning of signal, which says, the Israelites gained a most signal victory. So a most exceptional victory. So that's our second way of adding to a definition. The third way is statistically the most important in modern cryptic crosswords. In most crosswords, most cryptics these days, you're about 2/3 or 3/4 will be this kind, which actually divides into other kinds. And the way that these work is that you have the definition, and then you have some instructions that give you another way of making the answer. And those instructions we call the wordplay. And there are several ways of doing this. I think you can count up to about 8 or 9 different ones. I'm listing 6 here, which are the ones that are most important. The first way is called either additive or charades, from an old parlour game. I don't know whether you get this game in Israel, but in Victorian or Edwardian times, people used to play this game where you would stand up in front of an audience and they had to guess the word that you were trying to convey to them, and you conveyed it to them by chopping up your word into little parts and acting out a scene that suggested one part, and then acting out a scene that suggested another part. So you were signalling parts of the word that people had to stick together, and that's what we do here. So here's one example. It says, does a criminal past lead to strife? ? And the answer to this is performs. Because if you do something, you perform it, and then you have got a as the next word, and one meaning of a in English is the same as per, as in miles per hour being miles an hour, with a slightly different form of a, but the same meaning. Then a criminal past in slang is referred to as form, and then lead to strife is a way of indicating the first letter of strife, which is the S. So you've got 3 parts that go per, form, and S, and you just put them together in the order that you've got them in the clue, because there's nothing to tell you to do anything else, and that produces the answer for you. Second example says, reluctant to see husband after shower, brackets 4. And the answer here is loath, L-O-T-H, which I think can sometimes be L-O-A-T-H, meaning reluctant. And this gives us our first example, well, no, second example of, no, sorry, first example of a one-letter abbreviation. There's S we indicated as the first letter of a word, so we can do that with any word we like. Some words are commonly abbreviated by a single letter, usually the first letter, and one of them is husband. And the words in question you can find in the dictionary. You can look up the letter H and see husband as one of its meanings. So we see husband, in other words, H, after something that means shower. And one meaning of shower is a collection of many things, which is just a lot. So we put H after lot because we've got the word husband, as we've got after added to the two parts. So that tells us that the order isn't just A, B, C, it's A after B, if you like. So that's one way. The next way with wordplay is anagrams. You take some letters in, you take some words in the clue and you mix up their letters to produce the answer. So this one says, traveling to Peru in car from San Juan, question mark, 6,5. There's a bit of general knowledge here. San Juan is the main city, and I should think capital city of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, yeah. And if you're from San Juan, you are Puerto Rican. And Puerto Rican is an anagram of to Peru in car. Now, one thing we have to note here is that because we're not just taking a word and substituting another meaning, we're actually doing something to the parts of the word. We have to have a word that tells us to do that. And in this case, that's traveling. So traveling tells us that things are moving around and indicates the anagram. So most of these definition plus wordplay clues need an indicator word. And as you'll see in the real puzzle, spotting those words is a significant skill that helps people to get started with the crossword. The next one's called sandwich, or sometimes container and contents, and that means we take something and we put it inside something else. In this example, we're dealing with whole words. No, we're not quite, nearly whole words here. We've got turn male into amusing fantasist, 6,5, so a 6-letter word and a 5-letter word. And a fictional fantasist was Walter Mitty, character created by James Thurber a long time ago, but people still refer to Walter Mitty people as people who, well, it's an alternative to people like Peter Pan, if you like. Well, not quite Peter Pan, because Peter Pan was eternally young, but he was possibly a fantasist as well. Anyway, and so that's your fantasist, and the rest of the wordplay, we take the word turn, which can mean to change something, and that gives us alter, and then male is another abbreviation, so that gives us the M, and an alternative for missing, so sorry, an alternative for amusing is witty. So we put alter M inside witty to get Walter Mitty. So what we've actually done here is we've combined the idea of putting something inside something else with the idea of putting two things next to each other. So we've got an additive element, and then we've put that inside something else. And lots of clues it turns out, actually combine more than one of the things which we should really call clue techniques. But for some reason in crossword language, we call them clue types. But the truth is that the biggest clue type of all is what we might call compound, which is a mixture of clue types. And you'll see lots of those mixtures in the real puzzle. The next one is called hidden word, which is a bit like a sandwich clue, because you've got something inside something else, but this time the something inside something else is right there in the clue. So this one says state protocol or a document containing it. And the answer is Colorado, which is an American state, and state is accepted as an indication that usually means one of the 50 American states. And the words protocol or a document contains Colorado as a string of letters, which is right there in the clue, and then containing it tells you is the indication that it's inside those words. And that is supposed to be the easiest clue type. It's the easiest clue type if you realize what's going on, because if you realize that a hidden word is a possibility, all you have to do is look, and hopefully, and unless the answer is a word that you're not going to recognize, then you'll get the answer. But that said, you do have to spot that it's that kind of clue. And there are embarrassing moments in solving sometimes where it turns out that the last clue you solve is the hidden word. And you think, oh dear, I should have saved some time there. Anyway, next two, which are the last two I'm going to talk about here and now. First one is called reversals. Again, these are usually part of a compound clue using more than one technique, but here's one that is just a reversal. And this says, a bit of equipment's rejected, it's stolen property. 4 letters. And the idea here is that a tool, T-O-O-L, is a bit of equipment. And if you turn that backwards, you get loot, which is a name for stolen property. And the final kind I'm mentioning here is called subtractions. We start with one word and we take out part of it to get another word. So this one says, dogs heading off bird of prey. And one kind of dog is a beagle. And if you take its heading off, you get eagle, which is the word of the bird of prey. So that's the main kinds of clue, and with short examples of each. There are some other kinds, and some of those we'll see in the puzzle, but that should do for the moment. And then going back to the first thing I said in those clues, I'm saying again, because I won't get many chances to say this again while we're going through the puzzle, the clue has to mean something and resemble normal English. And when I mentioned the crossword editor at the time was changing in 1983, and the rather charming old gent who was that man had a lovely quote about crossword clues. Well, a lovely quote, a true quote, and it said, the worst thing you can say about a crossword clue is that it could only be a crossword clue. Right? That's his version of the clues must look like convincing English. And if you try to write cryptic crosswords, it's very easy to write a cryptic crossword equivalent of, I'm sure you've heard of this example, from Noam Chomsky, where he says, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, which is a sentence that makes absolutely perfect grammatical sense. But in terms of logic, it's complete nonsense, because you can't be colorless and green, and you can't be an idea and have a color, and you can't be an idea and sleep, and you can't sleep furiously. So it's absolute nonsense, but it makes logical sense. And you can similarly write cryptic clues that are absolute nonsense as a piece of language, but they do convey the answer. And although those work as a cryptic clue and people will quite happily solve them, we don't want to print those kind because they're just not satisfying. So that's my quick run through of, sorry, I knew I was going to do that, of cryptic clue types. And now I'm going to switch back to, I'm going to switch over to my slideshow. Sorry, no, I'm not. I'm going to switch to something else, aren't I? I've forgotten how to get out of, no. Here we go, right. Okay, so I'm going to go and find the crossword. And that's done. Here we go. Right, so this is the crossword we're going to solve. And this puzzle was printed in the paper about 2.5 months ago. And one of the things I do when I test solve the puzzles is I actually mark on my test solving copy the clues that I solve the first time that I look at them. And I do that just as a guide, just to give me some indication of how difficult the crossword is. I might solve 2 or 3 on the first look, and I might solve 15 on the first look. Somewhere in between is ideal, and I think the number for this was 8. So the first clue that I solved was 9 across. This one here. Cheese is said to give you wind, okay, which sounds like something problematic with diet, but of course it isn't. So the single word here that's most significant to me as an experienced solver is the word said. And said is one of the possible indicators for a homophone or sounds like clue. So if it's a homophone clue, where we've either got something that sounds like cheeses and gives you and is a wind, or we've got a word that means to give you wind that sounds like cheeses, and there aren't many words that mean to give you wind. So I think we're looking for a word for cheeses that sounds like something that is a wind. And cheeses is a plural, which means that it's very likely, like cheeses, to end in the letter S. But when we're talking about the sound of those words, we have to remember that in English plurals, as spoken, there are actually 2 different sounds. If you've got a plural of cat, then the plural is cats, where the final letter does sound like an S, which is the name of its letter, because it's a S sound. But if your word is cad, then the plural is cads. And instead of a S sound, you've got a Z sound. And that would normally be spelled in writing with a Z if the word was not a plural. So our answer probably has an S or a Z near the end. And lots of English words end in SE or ZE. So that S or Z is quite possibly not the last letter. Other point, the cheese probably has 1 syllable. If you take cheddar, for example, cheddars, as those cheeses, would have 8 letters and just wouldn't fit. Am I running out of time here?
No, you're good. Yeah.
I'm going to keep going as fast as I can. Right. Okay, so our cheeses are a French kind of cheese, which is called Brie. So the cheeses are Bries, and a breeze, spelt like this, is a gentle wind. So that's the cheeses said, giving you the wind, which is breeze. Now, at this point, what I would normally do is to read this clue and this clue and this clue, because I've got a letter in the word. As it happens, I haven't got any of those marked as ones that I solved on the first look. So I'm going to steam on to the next one that was solved on first look, which is 19 across. And this says, edification intended in speech by gambler. And once more, we've got something about talking, because it says in speech. And once more, that means that there is a sound like going on, but it's a more complicated sounds like. In this case, the word intended is equated with the word meant, M-E-N-T, which means intended. And if you speak that word, it sounds the same as M-E-N-T would sound, except that M-E-N-T isn't actually an English word. And people moan sometimes a little bit when your sounds like produces a word that's not actually an English word, because they say, how do I know I would pronounce it that way? Well, if it's M-E-N-T, then you can quite confidently say to them, well, if it was C-E-N-T, it would be sent, and B, if it started with B, it would be bent, and so with T, it would be tent. So they all sound the same except for the first letter, so it must be M-E-N-T, or that must be what M-E-N-T sounds like. And then we put that next to, indicated by, a word for gambler. And what does a gambler do? They bet. So a gambler is a bettor, which again is a word that can mean something else. So what we get is better meant, and betterment as a word means improving yourself or edifying yourself. So that's the edification. This time I did much better with the crossing words. I wouldn't bother to look at this point at 2 down, because it's not going to give me any help with other words that are the acrosses that I haven't looked at yet. So I start with 20 down. And this says, hard to believe, City finally score. Now, the word that should jump out for experienced solvers here is finally, because as a way, you get lots of clues where you have an indication for most of the word, and you've got 1 letter or maybe 2 letters left over. So you very often, in writing the clues, you very often need to indicate a single letter. And one way of doing it is, we've seen the beginning of a word indicated by leader of, or I can't remember exactly how it was said, but we saw the first letter of a word beginning with S. City finally is just telling us to use the Y from city. And that goes at the end, as a letter Y very often does in English words. And one word meaning hard to believe in a story. If a story is hard to believe, then it's a tall story. So tall plus Y gives us tally, which means a score. There's a complicated bit of history about that, but I'm going to skip that because we're short of time. So then I looked at 17 down, demonstrated how empty hand cream could be recycled. So this isn't a clue. This is not a clue about where you put your empty hand cream container. The definition here is demonstrated. One fact about the definition plus wordplay clues is that the definition is about 99.5% of the time at the beginning of the clue or at the end of the clue. So if you look at the first 2 words in the first word, or the first 2 words in the clue, and the last word or the last 2 words in the clue, in most crosswords, one of those 4 choices will be the definition something like 3/4 of the time. So in this case, you could consider demonstrated how, or be recycled, or recycled. So if one way of demonstrating is to march on a protest march, and that's an anagram of cream plus an H and a D. And the H and the D come from this empty hand. And there's a bit of crossword tradition here, which is that we allow the outside letters of a word to be thought of as a container for the rest of the word, or as clothing for the rest of the word. So the empty hand is the hand that hasn't got the inside letters in it, so that's the H and the D. And the anagram indicator here is a slightly subtle one, because it's how, and then effectively ... could be recycled. That's the part of the clue that's indicating the anagram, and that's on both sides of empty hand cream, which makes it a little bit more difficult to spot. So that's marched. The next one is probably the easiest clue in the whole puzzle, and I'm going to turn on an option here. In this system for solving the puzzles online, you get the option to fill it, to indicate where words begin and end inside each of the answers. And if you're doing this on paper, if you saw a clue that went 2, 3, 4, and 6, if you didn't see the answer straight away, you would draw these little black lines yourself with your biro, because seeing where the words begin and end is a big help. The other thing that can be a huge help, when these multi-word answers are very long, like 15 letters, sometimes there is only one common expression that fits the lengths of the words. And in this example, the only common expression that fits 2, 3, 4, and 6 is in the last resort. So if you manage to guess that, and the meaning of in the last resort is if everything else fails, this is what we're going to do. So it fits that part. So if you were in a hurry, if you were me in a crossword championship 20 years ago, you would just write in the last resort, and you probably wouldn't even worry about the rest of it, because you'd be wasting time. But the grand tour will end here. There's a little whimsical definition, because a grand tour can mean a long holiday. So if you're on a long holiday and you go to multiple resorts, the holiday must end in the last resort. So the final one that we've got a checking letter for here is this one: sort of pot one throws. And there's a lot of use in cryptic clues of one something, meaning somebody does something, or one meaning somebody, because one can mean other things. And in this case, one throws is telling us that the answer is somebody who throws things. And in a sporting, and that means, first off, that means it's almost certainly ends like that. And if you're somebody who throws things in a sporting context, if you're playing English cricket, then you're a bowler. But if you're playing American baseball, you're a pitcher. And a pitcher is also a sort of pot. And there's something else going on here, which is, or arguably something not going on, because if you're a potter and you make pots on a wheel, that's actually called throwing those pots. So a sort of pot one throws can actually be counted as just a plain definition for pitcher, because it's a kind of pot, and if you make it out of pottery, you throw it. But, and in old-fashioned cryptic crosswords, when the people who were making them hadn't had the benefit of decades of experience of doing this, they couldn't always think of a cryptic clue. for their answer. So sometimes they just gave you a vaguely worded definition that they hoped looked like a cryptic clue and would have you thinking, is this an anagram? Is there something? And then suddenly realize, no, it's just a plain definition with some eccentric wording. We don't do that anymore these days. Every clue must have, it might look like a straightforward clue, like this one does if you read it right, but it must also have cryptic logic. And the final word that was marked as solved first time is this one: domestic visa term and when it's renewed. And right, in this one, the phrase when it's renewed is not completely obvious, but it's actually an anagram indicator. When you renew something, you present it in a new way, and that's counted as good enough for indicating an anagram. And the words visa and term and between them have 11 letters, and so does the answer. And if you then think about the word domestic, it doesn't just mean relating to your home. It can mean a servant who works in your home. And at that point, you might notice that the letters in visa term and happen to contain the word servant as in an anagrammed form. So if we take, let's just do this. If we take, let's put the caps on. So we've got visa term and there, and then if we take servant and do the equivalent of crossing out the letters, oops. I forgot the R. We're left with IMAD, which is an anagram of another kind of servant, which is a maid. And if you put those two words together and make maidservant, that's also a word for a servant of a particular kind. So that's that one. Where are we now? Okay.
Peter?
Yeah.
We just about hit the 1 hour mark. Maybe it's a good time to see if anyone wants to have some questions.
Okay.
First, I want to tell this to people have been guessing the clues in the chat while we were analyzing them.
Sorry?
People have been guessing the clues in the chat while you were analyzing them. So words and quite well. So maybe it's to see if anyone has questions or remarks or something,
Sure.
comments, or just something.
Very interesting, inspiring.
Anyone?
Fascinating.
Anyone? Questions, remarks, anything? Just sharing your experiences. Yeah, yes. Just go ahead and unmute yourself or something.
I first learnt to do the crosswords in the Times and the Sunday Times by sitting down with other university students. We took 2 days. We took 2 days crosswords, and we looked at the answers and we tried to find the logic of that particular compiler. Obviously, sometimes on a Monday it was one compiler, and on a Tuesday it was another. But the Sunday Times tended to be pretty consistent, so that if you took a few weeks on the run, you could teach yourself crossword solutions.
The Sunday, well,
coffee breaks.
depending when it was. When I took over,
1970s, in the early 1970s, 72, 73, 74.
Okay, well, I think Barbara Hall was in the job back then, and when I took over, the rotation just before I took over was they had 4 people producing crosswords. One of them was Barbara herself, and then there were 3 gentlemen. And Barbara produced half of the puzzles. So if Barbara was set at A, the sequence went, if I remember rightly, A, B, A, C, A, D. No, sorry, A, B, A, C, A, B, A, D. So one of the other 3 did 2 puzzles in every 8, and the other 2 did 1 in 8. So if you did the puzzle when Barbara was in charge, half the puzzles might well have been by Barbara, so you would have got very used to her style. But in those days, they didn't actually tell you anything about who was writing them. They were completely anonymous. And there is also the chance that when other people sent her puzzles, she might have decided that some of the clues needed changing and done that herself. And that would mean that a bit of her style was in all of them.
The Sunday one used to be more difficult. And then if we were having an easy day, we did the Daily Telegraph.
I think that's still true.
Thanks.
Yeah, Ada, Ada, yeah, go. Ada, you're waving or? No? Ada? Mute yourself. No, I can't.
No, I wasn't going to, I didn't mean
Okay.
to wave. I
Okay,
just
I
think
remember.
that the word logic has almost nothing to do with what's going on here. It's more like association or imagination.
Well, you start, there's actually, in terms of how you solve them, there are 2 things that you need. You need a lot of imagination and vocabulary so that you can think, is this possibly the answer? And produce your initial guesses, right? But having produced your initial guess, you then need to switch from inspiration to the sort of cold logical analysis and work out whether there is the material in the clue to produce the answer that you think might be the answer. And you have to have both of those skills. And the same thing kind of applies in the crossword setting. You know, certainly in our clue writing competition, I see people who've had wonderful ideas and got very close to carrying them out perfectly, but they get one thing wrong, and suddenly their clue plummets from being a serious contender for the prize that week to nowhere because there's something wrong. So yes, you need inspiration and analysis, if you like.
Yeah, Reza, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I do agree, first of all, with Gila that sometimes when you're used to a certain paper or magazine or whatever, you learn the style, and it even if it's a team, there is a style, and I'm not saying it's repetitive, but you can learn the style as with any other logic. You can do that with chess. You learn your opponent, the style, so in order to beat him. But there is something that you can learn the method and overcome the method in somehow. And we had several in Israel radio programs with this kind of games, some people probably remember Capital Show and other by Rosen. But about the logic that Ada mentioned, there was a logical riddle made by, I forgot the name of the pilot, Hidete Gayon. Well, he had very difficult things, and Chamitzer, exactly. And you really need a very twisted logic in order to understand sometimes the hints that were given. But this is a remark. My question is, what's the format of how many words can you have, and how many across, how many, and how long does it take to write such a logical crossword?
Okay. As far as
Thank you.
I'm going to try to go back to. I'll go back to screen sharing. The standard size for a cryptic crossword is the one that you can see here, which is 15 squares wide and 15 squares tall. And the common standard these days for most papers, as a setter, you've normally got most of the papers will have a set of stock grids that someone at the paper has devised that you're allowed to use. And this is one of those grids that I've devised. But some papers, including us, these days allow the setter to choose his own grid if he wants. And one of our three on the Sunday Times Crossword does that every week. But this is one that I made. And the standard for number of answers these days is that if you've got the 8 across rows that you can see here, if you divide all of those into 2, that gives you 16 answers. So if you had the equivalent set of columns there and divided all of those into 2.
You've not shared your screen.
A total of
your screen. We can't see it. Sorry.
Am I not? Hang on. Where's that gone? I seem to have signed out. Sorry. Short pause here. I don't understand.
Whichever, even without the screen.
There we are. Bells. Can you accept that? Sorry, I'm failing to get back in. Sorry about this. So yeah, if you have 8 rows and 8 columns and you split them all in 2, that's 32. And I would count that as the maximum number of words for that kind of grid. For some designs, you get down to 28 or maybe even 26. and that's as small as we normally go in the Sunday Times, partly because we have a particular amount of space to fill in the paper, and although it's nice to have some spare room for people to scribble, you don't really want them to have all that spare room and then a tiny set of clues at the top. So somewhere between 26 and 32 is the number of answers in that size of grid. So that's that. In terms of the time it takes to write one, that depends on the depends on the person who's doing it. I have one person on my team who, if I needed him to, could write me a 15 by 15 cryptic crossword in about 2 hours. Most people, it's somewhere between half a day and a day. The single cryptic crossword that I write myself is for the Times literary supplement, and that's made a bit more complicated because, as well as writing cryptic clues, you're expected to make as many of the answers and clues as you can related to literature. So when you're building the grid, you're looking for book titles, names of characters, names of authors, that kind of thing. And then when you're writing the clues, if your answer is nothing to do with literature, but you can make the clue look as if it's to do with literature, then that's okay. But that adds to the time. So the TLS, if I'm honest, probably takes me 2 days to write.
Yeah, done.
Is there any software, computer software, that can help
There
you?
is. Yeah. I was. I'm going to try once more to share and see if I can get back in. So I'm going to leave the meeting on that screen and hopefully stay here. Yeah. And restart Zoom on here and see if I can get back in and share. This is looking better. That's better. Okay, the host will let me in soon. Yes, good.
Yeah.
Right, showing my screen. Okay, can you see the screen?
Not quite yet.
Hang on. Is that better? No?
No, I'm not seeing it yet.
Hells, bells. No. Oh, I see.
Yeah, now we got it.
Okay. Better? Okay, right. Okay, here is the software that people use. So you get a start point here where it deals with multiple kinds of grid. So if I was writing one of the Sunday Times ones, and if I was building my own grid, I would do something like this. So that gives you a sort of bare bones grid, and then you can choose your pattern. So you might do something like this, and you can see one requirement of a grid is that it's rotationally symmetrical. So if you turn the grid by 180 degrees, you get the same pattern of black squares. So we might do something like that. Actually, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do that. Oh dear, no. There we are. Okay, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I've got 16 across answers there, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, see, I've got 12 downs. That's a bit unbalanced, actually. What I would normally do is make that one. So that's staying as, okay, so what I've done here is I've made my long word and the acrosses. So now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 2 pairs of 7s in the acrosses, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 2. Yeah, I've got 28 clues for the whole puzzle, which is pretty much the average. And then in the software, the next thing you want to do is put words in the grid. Let's have a quick look at. Okay, I've got a rather strange set of. In the software, you've got lots of lists of words. So I'm just going to add a couple more of those. So I can click on a word here, and I would probably choose this long word first. So I can click here, choose a big dictionary, and I can look through the words and think which one of these might be good for a crossword clue, because not all words are. That looks quite interesting. I would be prepared to have a go at that. So you say, okay, I've got that, and then looking here, then you get the list of words that can fit going across that word, and you can gradually build up your list of words, your grid, except that sometimes you'll get yourself into a corner. So, for instance, with this one, the first word it's suggesting a bubble. I don't know what that is as a word, to be honest, but it would give you a word here that ends in a U, and that gives you not that many choices. So we've got, I don't know, maybe 40 choices there, but by the time you've put in some other words here, you could finish up finding that you don't have any words that end in that U. So choosing that word would be a bad move at this point in the grid build. So you build up your grid like that, and then once you've built your grid, you've then got a place where you can type the clues, and then inside of that, you've got a place where you can, as well as typing the clue, you can add some notes that the crossword editor will see. So you finish up being able to produce a document from this software with an export facility that looks something like this. That should do it. That's okay. So this is should hide this really, because this is an upcoming prize crossword. But this one, we've got the grid, we've got the clues on one sheet. So that's the version that you would solve. And then we've got the answers and the answers in text, and we've got some explanations. Hiding that fairly quickly. Oops. So that's a quick look at the software, and that software reduces the time involved hugely, and it also means if I look at a different kind of puzzle, we take an example here. This is this is just coming up, so this is not too bad, right? Well, this isn't a prize. There's no prize for this crossword, so it doesn't matter if you see the answers. Here we've got one of the general knowledge crosswords, and these are on a 21 by 21 grid, and the limit we set on the number of clues is 50, roughly, maybe 52. Which means that in each set of across and down, you're looking for 24 or 25. So in this one, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We've got 22 acrosses, and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Got 22 downs, which is not bad actually. That's only 44 clues overall, which means that you get a bit a chance to write slightly longer clues. If you were trying to build that kind of grid without the computer software, it would take absolutely ages. You know, taking this one, building that grid was probably hour and a half, 2 hours, because I would have, the setter, not me this time, would have chosen things like, he probably chose "his and mine are the same" as an intriguing phrase, and "something to answer for," which is the title of a book. And then, as you tend to choose the long words first, and he might well have chosen Fatima Whitbread, a javelin thrower of the past, and he might well have chosen Montgomery Scott, his character in Star Trek, and then you have to fit the rest. But again, it's very possible to paint yourself into an impossible corner and have to rework a quarter of the grid or something like that. Does that answer your question about making them?
Quite amazing. Thank you.
Can we do a few more crossword clues in the little time we've got left?
Yeah, sure. Let's go back to the puzzle. Here we go. So 13. Where was next after 13? Okay, the next one. Yes, the next thing I reckoned I would do. We've now reached the end of the ones that I solved the first time I looked at them, and I don't have a record of the solving order after that. But one thing I might have done next was to look at this bottom left-hand corner, because we got one word with 3 letters checked here. So it says, "After party, ruffian wanting a rumpus." So it sounds like somebody's after a fight after a party, but no. What's going on here is, let's get the text back. There we go. Right. One kind of party is a ball. So if we put ball here, if you know your English words, I think there's only one word that can possibly fit here, which is the word ballyhoo, which means a rumpus. And you can call a ruffian a yahoo. So the ruffian wanting or lacking a gives you the YHOO. Okay. And then after that, we would look at this one, the utterly boring device one holds the ear. And we've got some stuff about talking again. We've got to the ear, and a boring device that you can hold is one possibility for that is a little tool which is called, I don't know if you'll recognize this word, it's called an awl. You're looking blank, so I'm going to show you do a quick search here. I'm sure you've seen this kind of tool, but it's one of these little sticks with a spike that you use for boring little holes in things. So if you were going to put a screw into a piece of wood, you would start off with one of these to make the little preparatory hole. So that's the boring device, but that's what the answer sounds like. And another word that sounds the same as all with AWL is all with ALL, and that can mean utterly. So one bit of disguise in that clue, by the way, was the fact that utterly boring device or utterly boring look like phrases. But what you actually got to do is break them up into pieces, because utterly is the definition and boring, and the wordplay starts with the boring device. So when you're solving the puzzles, one key thing to do, if you can, is to spot where the wordplay ends and the definition begins, or the other way round. If you can spot that gap, you are at least halfway to getting to an answer. If you can't spot the gap, it's much harder. So one way we try to disguise the gap is to give you phrases like utterly boring or utterly boring device that go across that gap. And then we've got here, show tolerance. I've messed up my order here because I should have told you at some point that double definition clues very often have 2 words, and double definition was the second overall group of clues that I talked about, where you give 2 definitions. And if your clue for a word only has 2 words, it's about at least 80% certain, I would say, that it's a double definition. The only other kind it can really be is a cryptic definition, and you can write 2-word cryptic definitions, but it's pretty difficult. So we've got to find, so almost certainly we want a word that means show and means tolerance. And the way the clue is worded suggests that show means indicate tolerance, but it doesn't. Show here is just a thing called a show, and one thing that's called a show is a play. Okay, and another meaning of play, in a kind of technical sense, is the sort of adjustment factor that you're permitted in technical things for how well does something have to fit something else. If there's a degree of variation that you're allowed, it's called play, and it's also called tolerance. So that's why tolerance is the other definition. Now, where was I going next? I'm going to dive off my script because I'm not going to finish my script. This would be a very good one to look at next, because you've got 4 letters out of the 5 checkers, and you've got the first letter and the next and the second and third and fifth. And it says here, cleaners put up by toilets. Now, if you can think of a word for cleaners with 10 letters, which almost certainly means a word for cleaner with 9 letters and an S on the end, like the cleaners, that's probably the answer. And one thing that cleans things is a detergent. Whoops. Hang on, I'm just... And as well as meaning cleaners, to deter somebody is to put them off. And one option for toilets is the men's toilets, which in English slang is the gents, short for gentlemen, which it quite often says on the sign. So that's the answer there. And the other thing that I will look at soon is this one, because it's a 2-word answer, which makes it a bit easier. And we've got second word's first letter. And again, if you know your English words, the only common word that fits there is a concept that I'm sure you're familiar with as translators, a metaphor. And a term for clashing statements is mixed metaphors. Are people familiar with the idea of mixed metaphor? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so I won't waste time with an example then. So if mixed metaphors is the answer, what's going on in the clue? We've got the clashing statements as the definition, but how does harmed poets perhaps get us to mixed metaphors? Well, you might notice that harm poets is an anagram of metaphors. And what's actually going on in this clue is we're actually reversing the process of the logic, and we're counting the clue, we're counting the answer as effectively a clue. And what we're saying is that if you take the word metaphors and you mix it up, you can make that can mean making an anagram out of it. So, and one of the possible anagrams of metaphors is harm poets. So the harm poets perhaps is telling you that you've got a possible anagram, and we've reversed the process in the wordplay. We've put the indication and the anagram indication and the anagram fodder into the answer, and and treated them as a clue, as a little mini clue, and given you a possible answer to that wordplay that's in the answer. So we call, when this is done, we sometimes call it a reverse clue, or we sometimes call it wordplay in the answer. And in theory, you could do this for any of the types of clue that involve a definition and wordplay. In practice, because there are not that many words that can indicate things like homophones and hidden words, but there are thousands of words that can indicate anagrams, this is much easier to do with an anagram than the other kinds of clue. So you're most likely to see this little trick with anagrams. And we're now going to have a look at another one, which I'm going to tell you involves an anagram that says, how Soviet radars beam broadcast. Now, you can see that the answer has got 9,5, so it's got 14 letters. And if you count up the letters in how Soviet radar, that's 14 letters. And if you took those letters and you broadcast them in the oldest sense of the word broadcast, which basically means taking seeds out of an old sack in a big field and throwing them over the field, that's the original meaning of broadcast. And the fact that we call radio transmissions and TV transmissions broadcast is a metaphorical version of that just says we're taking this information and we're throwing it, well, here in this, as I speak to you today, we're throwing it from Britain to Israel. But so that's where broadcast originally came from. So broadcast could be used as an anagram indicator, but that means we've got the whole clue used up by the anagram letters and the indication that there is an anagram. So where's there any room for a definition? We've used up all the space. But what's going on here is that if you read the clue in a different way, radar has a connection with a form of broadcasting. And can you think of a form of broadcasting starting there with 5 letters, which I happen to have just mentioned, and it's radio. Oops. And if you take the letters of radio away from how Soviet radar, the letters that you get left happen to fit shortwave. And I checked this again today, and there's certainly a connection between shortwave radio and the transmission of radar. So how Soviet radar is being broadcast actually works as a definition of shortwave radio, and it works as the indication of the anagram plus the anagram content at the same time. So the whole clue means 2 different things at once. And that's very difficult to do. And if you do it well, as the letter does it very well here, then that's probably the best clue in the puzzle. I'll give you one more example of those from a very long time ago. This is a 9-letter answer. And the clue goes, I'm one involved with cost. And if you take the letters of I'm one and cost and make those into an anagram, you can make the word economist. And one of the things that economists worry about, having done economics at university, is cost. So an economist is one who's involved with cost. So that's a very old example of this kind of clue. Probably the oldest that I know about, but does not necessarily the first one. Do we have time for any more?
I have no idea. We've been running a bit over time, but
if people are happy, I'll just bash on. I'm going to look next at we're going to have a bit of regional English here. If you know the English words in this clue, I'll be very impressed. Or know two of them, and they're important too. We've got fret about the wings in navigating part of an airfield. So this sounds like it's a tale about somebody landing in a jumbo jet at a relatively small airport and thinking, oh crumbs, I've got to be really careful to get my plane back to the terminal. But no, it's not. The easy part of this is the bit that says wings in navigating. I talked a while ago about how a word being empty. Well, similar sort of imaginative meaning. If a word has wings, that's a fancy way of saying first and last letter of the word. So the wings in navigating are the N and the G. And then we've got something that says fret about the wings in navigating, and that means that the wings in navigating are going inside something else. And somewhere in that, we've got something that's part of an airfield. And you've probably, some of you have guessed that what's part of an airfield here is a hangar, which is a garage for planes, basically. So then you've got the fact that fret is indicating this H-A-A-R. And this is the very strange regional English, which is known from weather forecasts. Fret is a word for a sea mist on the North Sea coast, and har, H-A-A-R, is another word for the same thing. So if you've got an H-A and A-R sequence in an answer, one way to challenge people is to use fret in the clue, because fret is going to look as if it means worry and has to be substituted with har. You can't really go the other way round, and you can't really use har in the clue to indicate fret, because har doesn't, H-A-R-R, doesn't mean anything else in English. It only means one thing, so it wouldn't fool anybody. So you'll see it this way round, but not the other way round. Next one has to be this one, because we've got the A at the beginning, and it says chap who's desperate to get in air after a ducking. And this requires a bit more in British cultural knowledge. There was a cartoon character, well, not quite cartoon character, comic character, comic meaning a magazine of cartoon strips, who was called Desperate Dan. And he was a Wild West man with huge, great chin and stubbly beard drawn on his chin, and he supposedly ate cow pie, and he was a sort of thuggish kind of fellow, and he was called Desperate Dan. So the chap who's desperate is Dan, and if we're going to put Dan into this answer, there's only one place where it can go, because there's no other three-letter space. Whoops. Oh dear. I've put it in the wrong spot. Right. Right, there we go. Now, what's happening with the rest of it? So Dan has to go inside air after A. And there's an A in the clue, in the answer, and that's matching the A in the clue. So that's just indicating itself. And if you air something as an idea, then you say it or you voice it. So that's the voice that goes there. And if you avoid something, then in colloquial English, you duck it. So ducking is avoidance. And again, it's nothing to do with the normal meaning of ducking, which means being dipped into water. So then we would have a look at this one. And this is much harder. 2 reasons why it's hard. It's a 4-letter word. And from my days of competing in Times Championships, 4-letter words cause me more trouble than anything else. And the reason for that is not so much with this one. If I borrow this 4-letter word here, if you've got something like that from checking letter from the other words, you've got blank A, blank E, the number of words that can go there is huge. So you can't do the same sort of thing that we did with mixed metaphors and guess a word just from the letters that you've got there. You have to find the meanings and logic and solve it properly. You can't guess at it from the words that are there, from the letters that are there. This isn't quite so bad. I looked up D blank, R blank, and I found something like 30 possibilities in the dictionary. And I would say that about half of those are sensible answers for this kind of crossword. What's going on here is that if something's urgent, then it can also be called dire. It's desperate, like Dan, or dire, and that's urgent. But what's going on in the rest of the clue? Well, if you command somebody to do something, then you can also call that directing them to do something. Okay, so command can mean direct. And then to get to dire from direct, you have to take out the CT at the end. And CT, especially in street maps of towns, can mean the word court as an alternative to a street. So that's the clear court. So this is not anything to do with some emergency at Wimbledon, which the clue is trying to convince you. And so that's a subtraction clue. And from years of experience, those subtraction clues can be the hardest to work out, even when you've got the answer. And the reason they're difficult to work out is with the other clue types, you can see all the bits and pieces involved somewhere in the answer that you've got. Okay? But in the word dire, when you've got it written in the grid, you can't see direct. You have to imagine that in your head. So that makes those harder. So where are we going to go next? I think we're going to look at the ones that have got multiple words. This is a good example. This has got 3 words, all very short. So degenerate's daughter is excluded from visit, or that's what it seems to say. This is where you have to remember that degenerate, or the word spelt in the same way as degenerate, has 2 meanings. And one is unsatisfactory or lazy or whatever, like or teenagers maybe. And another word is to go bad, which is to degenerate. And that's the meaning we actually need. But because the bloke writing the clue put daughter next to it, you naturally think that it's degenerate, but it isn't. It's degenerate. And if you degenerate, a less fancy way of saying that fairly old-fashioned English, is to say that it's gone to seed, or to degenerate is to go to seed. Okay, and if you take that go to seed, and then you exclude the D for daughter, you get go go to see, and if you go to see someone, you visit them. Now, when you're thinking about these kind of clues, you have to be a little bit careful when you're solving, because you could have a situation where the answer means visit, and the word behind that was a, sorry, that is the situation. Oh, sorry. You could have a situation where the answer is the word for degenerate, and the indication of the rest of it could be D is included from visit, and in that case you would be looking for the 8-letter word to mean visit and the 7-letter word to mean degenerate or degenerate, but only one of those works, and that's the one we've just seen. And there are quite a few times when you get two choices like that, and you just have to work out which of them actually works and which doesn't. So the next one I'm looking at now is this one, because we've got the first letter of the second word. And this says, special way to enter competition used by seeds. And again, it seems like we're talking about Wimbledon, but we're not. I think the easiest part of this is probably the competition, because in this case, the setters suggested Wimbledon, and if you're competing in tennis, you can compete in a tournament that's called an Open, or you can do the same in golf. So the competition is open, and if, I don't know if you know about pantomime in Britain, as humorous shows that we put on around Christmas time, and one of the pantomimes is based on Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. And the thing that everybody knows about Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves is that at some point in the story, they have to say something, a magical password, to get through a gateway or a doorway. And the magical password is open sesame. Yeah? And sesame is the name of a plant, and it's a plant that only grows in tropical areas. So in a British context, the only time we see sesame is as the seeds on a hamburger bun, or that kind of, or the seeds used in that way. So that's the seeds. So the competition is used by seeds. Well, used by is just a long way of saying goes next to, that happens to suit the wording that he wanted to achieve to tell his story. Let's have a look at this one, because we've got T blank T at the beginning. We've got horse for one, desperate to depart. And we've got desperate again, but it's not Dan. Desperate this time is yet another anagram indicator. And the words to depart have a total of 8 letters. And 2 of them are those T's. And if you think of a horse, one fairly clear feature of a horse is that it has 4 legs. And if you say 4 legs in classical Greek, it's something like tetrapod. Okay, so that's your to depart anagram, and it's the horse. Now, there's a little subtlety here of crossword rules. We've seen lots of things where, let's see, we said something like party, and we said a kind of party was a ball, right? We could say, and we could say that a horse is a kind of tetrapod, but because not all tetrapods are horses, you can't quite say that tetrapod implies horse in quite the same way as you can say that something like celebration includes a ball or a party. And in the rules that we have in cryptic crosswords, we say, if you're going that opposite direction and using an example of something to indicate the class, like tetrapod here, you have to say something like horse, for example, or horse for one. Okay? Now, I'm saying that's crossword tradition because I don't think it's actually necessary all the time. There are some words, some cases where that set of rules doesn't help the solver at all. If we've got something like fish in the clue, and it's indicating trout or shark or any of the other 5-letter fish, or if you don't know yet whether it's indicating the whole answer or part of the answer, then you've got even more possible fish to think about. You could be talking about dozens or even hundreds of kinds of fish, and you're expected to guess to find the right one. But, and you get the same kind of thing with dogs. I should have started with dogs as the answer, sorry. So if you think of 8-letter dogs, I've got a list that I could read out, which has got about 30 or 40 8-letter dogs, right? So if you say dog and 8 letters, it's like an old concise crossword. You have to guess which dog it is. If you said Alsatian, which is an 8-letter word meaning dog, the only other thing it can mean is a person who comes from Alsace, but that doesn't mean that very often in English. It practically always Alsatian means dog. But because of this tradition, we say it's fine to say dog and expect the solver to guess that it's Alsatian. But if you say Alsatian, you have to say dog, for example, even though dog is practically the only thing you're going to think of as soon as you see the word Alsatian. But there we go. That's the way things have worked out. Let's have a look at this one across the top. And the reason for looking at that is the ending. We've got I blank G. And you can probably guess that I'm going to tell you that it's something like 99.9% certain that the letter there is an N. I can't think offhand of any IAG words, certainly not any IBG or other I consonant or I hard consonant, if you like, G words. It's pretty much got to be ing. So most people would, as soon as they see the I and the G, they would take their biro and they'd write the N in before they read the clue. So we've got what a shopper might do to grab stuff and dash. Sounds like a bit of burglary going on, but it's not. We've got, again, this notion of something ending in ER, meaning someone who does something. So a shopper is someone who shops, and that's there in the meaning that they're trying to convey, but shop can mean something else. Shop can mean that you tell the police about somebody and what they're doing when it's something that he doesn't want the police to know about. So you shop him to the police. And another expression for that in sort of underworld slang is to sing to the police. So if we take sing and have the last 3 letters there as the last 3 letters of sing, and we put an S there because there's grabbing going on, then we want a 6-letter word that means stuck, and the whole answer means dash. And again, the way the clue's written is making you think that dash means run. No, it doesn't. In this case, we're thinking of a dash of something or a small amount. Okay? And I'm pretty sure you must have come across the expression from people, especially from England, who speak hardly anything of any words in a foreign language, and they say, they don't say I'm very sorry. They don't say I'm very sorry, sir. I only speak one word of Hebrew. They say, oh, I have just a smattering of Hebrew. I think you've probably heard English people say that. Oh, oops. So a smattering is a small amount or a dash, and stuff, meaning just material making things, is matter. So that's that one. The next, this one's quite interesting. 2 fish cut by a small pointed tool. And we've had one pointed tool already that we've talked about. This is another one, as it happens. And the reason this is interesting is that it's, you know, when you're trying to write clues, you're looking for interesting features of words and that you can actually put in as part of a clue that's going to make people think. And one thing that's really nice to see is when you can find a word that's got 2 words inside it, which both mean roughly the same thing, but they don't mean anything to do with the meaning of the word that you're writing the clue for. So in this case, a word that means pointed tool has got 2 words meaning fish in it, and they are cut or divided by this letter S here, which is an abbreviation for small. If you're small, then it very probably says S on your t-shirt, on the label indicating the size. Okay, so before that S and after that S, we're looking for 2 words that mean fish, and the whole word means a pointed tool. Well, one kind of fish in rivers in the UK is called a pike. Long, thin, fairly big fish, not sometimes eaten, not terribly nice to eat apparently, and that makes the word spike at the end of the clue. And this is another word where part of the word means the same as the answer, because a spike is something pointed and you could use it as a tool. And there's a particular kind of tool that's called something spike, with another fish going here that's the M blank R blank blank blank. And this is the kind of fish that Ernest Hemingway might have gone fishing for, I think, in his boats off Florida and places like that. And it's called a marlin. Big fish like a tuna. And a marlin spike is, if you like, another version of an awl. We've got the awl pictures here. I'm going to change to marlin spike. So a marlin spike is either this pointy part of one of the tools of a penknife, or if we're lucky, we might see a, there we go. This one at the right hand, this one that I've highlighted just here, that's a much bigger, and it's the only tool, or this one here with the Wikipedia article, it's just a long spike. And it's a tool that you use for to help you start to untie a knot. If you're at sea, for instance, and you've got a knot in rope that's really tight and has been filled up with, and has been got seawater and salt on it, so you can't get a grip on it, you can stick a marlin spike into part of the knot and start to ease it apart. So that's what a marlin spike is, and it just so happens that we've got 2 tools of very similar kinds in the puzzle. Let's have a look at this one, because we've got 4 out of 5 checking letters. It says, as a result of whistleblower, the mineral deposits protected. Well, this sounds like a story of something going on with mining activity and someone blowing a whistle, but it's not actually a metaphorical whistleblower. It's somebody who just blows a whistle, a real whistle, and that's someone like a football referee, or in short, they're called ref. And again, well, it could, in theory, it's possible, at least logically, that it could go there, but there are not many English words that begin TREF. So we're going to put it here. And with the only two letters left, you can probably see that the answer is therefore, which means the same as a result of. And outside of the ref or whistleblower, we've got the here representing itself. And then we've got an ore, O-R-E, which is a mineral deposit. Then we've got, this is one of those nasty four-letter words, because we've got blank I, blank E. And this is the one where I'm going to try a bit of Hebrew, because it says dance judge that is introducing a Latin number. So it sounds like it's about ballroom dancing, as in, I think, Rokdim im Kochavim. Does that sound right?
Close enough. Yeah.
Yes, or in English, in the British version, is called Strictly Come Dancing. And it seems to be a story about that, and it's not actually that far away, because the answer...
Yeah, like the show.
Sorry?
Like the show, the British show.
Yeah. So, and the answer this time is not that far away from the TV dancing show, because the answer is a kind of dance that you could see on that show. And what's going on in the clue is we've got judge, which can be abbreviated by J, and then we've got that is. And that is the English meaning of the Latin id est that gets abbreviated to IE, meaning this is something is the same thing as that, so, or something means that happens. So that's the I and the E, and that's introducing or inserting a Latin number. And the clues said as being a little bit cheeky here, and he's using the letter V, which is a Roman numeral, and he's calling that a Latin number, which we wouldn't call it in English, but it's close enough to understand what he means. And we get jive, which is the dance. Let's have a look at that one, because we've got all the checking letters. Level of experience around old university. Well, there are two more single letter indicators going on here, which are the abbreviations. And you won't be too surprised if I tell you that that O there is represented by the old in the clue. And after the old, the word you've got is university. And university can be abbreviated by U. And university, from the solver's point of view, university is the easy word here, because there are not many words that are abbreviated by U. And university is one of the few choices that the set has got. So if you see university in the clue, there is a good chance that there is a letter U somewhere in the answer. So around the OU for old university, you've got level of experience, or sorry, you've got level and then you've got experience. So level must be the definition. And something that is experienced is an event. from the EVEN and the final T. And if you even something out, then you level it. So then we've got one little corner left. Let's start with this one. This says, where ships are docked and legends recounted. This sounds like you've got an old ship coming in from a 2 or 3 year long journey, and people getting off the ship and telling you stories about what happened. No, you haven't. What you've got is where ships are docked. So, where are ships docked? Well, arguably in a dock. But if you've got the word docked in the clue, the answer is not going to be dock. That's too easy. So we're looking for a word like a harbour or part of a harbour. And part of a harbour is the word quay, spelt with Q-U-A-Y. Yeah? And if you're looking at a map, and the other thing that's going on here is the word recounted, meaning told as of a story, that's a more subtle way of indicating a sound like, or a homophone. It's more direct, it's more subtle than said or reported, but it's doing the same job. And we're looking for a word that sounds like keys. So we're looking for, and that's pretty much got to be K-E-Y-S. And a key on a map is the little bit in the corner that tells you what all the symbols on the map mean. And that area of that little part of the map is also called a legend. So that's where the legends, so the legend in the clue is indicating, legends in the clue is indicating those keys as K-E-Y-S, and then you're making the sound of those to get the keys where the ships are docked. So then we've got to look at this one, which starts with a Q. Then we've got teams heading off court. It sounds like mixed doubles or something like that, but it isn't. The fact that you've got heading off should be saying to you that you've got that you're starting with a word that's 5 letters long, and you're taking its heading off, because heading could mean the beginning of something. So it's first letter, and by sort of crossword tradition, when we say the beginning of something, of a word, even if the word's got 27 letters, the beginning is counted as just the single first letter, or the end of the word is counted as the last single letter. So we know that we've got a 5-letter word, and the 5-letter word could mean team, and we could take the heading off that word to get a word for court, or we could have heading off court, meaning that the court is the 5-letter word and the 4-letter word means team. Okay, either of those are possible. So can we think of a word of 4 or 5 letters that means team? And can we think of a word that's 4 or 5 letters that means court, where one of those words is the other word with the first letter dropped off? And the pair that we're looking for, we have to understand the right meaning of court. And it's not quite a tennis court. It's a court of similar meaning. It's a roughly rectangular area in a larger building, like in particular a college at Oxford or Cambridge University. If you go into a college, okay, or one of those universities, you go off the street and you go into this big area, big square area with all the buildings around it, and the big square area is called the quad, short for quadrangle. And so that's the court, and the team is a squad. So then we've got one last one to do, and this is nice and easy from the letters that we've got. We've got A blank O, and in everyday English, there are two choices. It could be a do. Whoops, it's a do. I should have guessed the other one first. The other one was a go. Right? So we've got fleece under a bustle. And a bustle in Victorian English was a large lady's dress or part of a lady's dress. And you could, I suppose, have tucked a fleece underneath it, but that's not what's going on here, really. What you've really got is a word that means fleece, and it's tucked under the letter A, and the answer is another meaning of bustle. And hustle and bustle means activity, and another word for activity is ado, as in much ado about nothing is much activity about nothing. Yeah. So the word for fleece is do, and again we're using slang meanings. If you fleece somebody, you deceive them or rob them of some money, or well, usually both. And if someone tells you that, then you might say, "Oh, you've been done, mate, haven't you?" So you can, as well as fleecing them, you do them. That's as one of the umpteen meanings of the word do. So now we've finished the puzzle in the very fast time of 145 minutes. We didn't really take that long. We did, didn't we?
Yes.
Well, we took that long after including the time talking about how things worked. So there we are. There we have the puzzle. I'm just going to tell you one other thing, just in case you try to do these. I've sent the notes that I wrote for the whole talk, which includes some stuff I didn't get to Yuri, and that does include the details on a couple of books. There are two books that I would really recommend if you're interested in solving these puzzles and want to get some help. And they both happen to be written by men who wrote crosswords for the Sunday Times. The first one is the one that I read back in 1987, and that's by a man called Don Manley. And his book is called Chambers' Crossword Manual. And that's now in its 5th edition, because it's nearly 25 years after 1987 when I read his first edition. And I actually got to edit or proofread the 5th edition and managed to make a few contributions or corrections. But I don't get any earnings from you buying the book. I've had my fee already. And his book has lots of information about how the cryptic clues work. And it also has lots of information about the history of crosswords and the way the business works. It's even got a list of 10 points advising crossword editors on how they should do their job. So it covers the whole field, and it also has some material about puzzles that are far more difficult than the one we've just looked at. That's one of the two books. The other book is by a man called Tim Moorey, and that's called How to Crack Cryptic Crosswords, and it's published by published by HarperCollins, who published books for Times and Sunday Times. And Tim spends a lot of his time, or at least outside of lockdown, giving courses on how to solve cryptic crosswords. He will have people listening to him for, I think it's 2 or 3 days that he spreads the course over. And he obviously goes into far more detail than I can go to, that I've been able to go into in my couple of hours here. And he's used the experience that he's got from those courses and what people have asked him about and said that they found difficult. He's used that extremely well. And his book is entirely about how to solve cryptic crosswords like the one that we've just looked at. So if you want this, if that's the focus that you want, that is the book to get. And he explains how the clues work in, well, more detail than I've had time for today, obviously, and in more detail than Don, because Don's including other material in his book. That's one thing to look at. The other thing you can look at is some websites. So as I'm still screen sharing, I'm going to show you some of those. Right. Except that this, here we go, right. Okay, one thing I mentioned about my life in crosswords was starting a blog. And this is the blog that I started back in 2005. And have we got the, is this the current one? So here we've got somebody who joined the blogging team when I was still in charge, and he's writing about today's Times crossword. And and because this is not a competition puzzle, this analysis appears on the same day as the actual puzzle. So he goes through the puzzle, and for each clue, he underlines, he gives you the clue, he underlines the definition, and then he tells you the answer and how he got there. So you get the answer. This is the reason why the blogs are useful. If you look at the answers in the newspaper the next day, all you get is a list of words or a completed grid. You don't get any of this explanation. You have to work it out for yourself. And that means that you can learn something from looking at the answers the next day, but you don't learn that much. And that process of learning can be very, very slow. So with this information here, you can learn much faster because you've got about 30 sample clues, and you've got the answer and you've got the explanation of how they work. And if you look at that every day for a week, that's about 200 sample clues, or with a few other kinds of crossword added, it's more like 300 or 400, because the Times these days has another cryptic that's rather easier, and we've got an analysis of that as well. So you've got huge amount of knowledge that you can absorb from these blogs. And when I started writing, running this blog 15 years ago, you would get people who would join. You'll also see that somewhere under here. Right, we've got a whole set of comments. So as well as the report on how the clues work, you'll get a whole load of people saying how long it took them to do the puzzle, where they struggled, where it was easy, what they thought was good, what they thought was bad. And in those comments, when I was running the blog, you would see people who appeared as a brand new solver, and they said, I'm beginning this is really helpful information. And you would see them gradually improve. And something like 2 years later, they would comment on a puzzle and say, hooray, this is the first time I've completed Times crossword all on my own. And you thought, 2 years, crumbs. Because I remembered back to my days, and I started trying to solve the Times crossword in 1976. And although I had a gap of not trying that crossword for a while, it was something like 7 years of solving for me before I was solving complete Times crosswords. So this information really does speed things up. So that's one thing you can do. And my blog is called Times, or the blog that I started, it's no longer mine because I'm not involved anymore, because I would be commenting on my own material, which wouldn't be fair. So it's called Times for the Times, and you will see here on its checklist of links, it says other solving blogs. And there's one here that says 15 Squared, Independent, Guardian, and Financial Times. So that's another blog which covers the crosswords for those papers. And then it says Big Dave's Telegraph crossword blog. That's another one which does the Daily Telegraph and Sunday Telegraph. And between those 5 papers that we've just listed and the Sunday editions, that's the whole market of really good cryptic crosswords in daily papers in the UK. There are other cryptic crosswords, but they don't get the same attention. So if you read one of those papers and look at the blog for the crossword, you will learn pretty fast. The other site that I'm going to show you is the one for the clue writing report. Because nowadays, when I joined the paper, we had the clue writing contest, and what happened was that people sent in their clues on little postcards, and you would choose the winning clue, and the winning clue got printed in the paper along with the name of the person who sent it, and all of the other postcards just got thrown away. And the people who sent the clues that were nearly good enough to win, they got no information, and the people whose clues were terrible didn't get any information either. So after about 6 months or so, I started writing these reports. So here's an example. This is quite a good one. Right. Okay, we have the answer. And what happens each week is that I choose a word that we haven't used before in this competition. And the idea is that the contestants have to dream up a clue to that word, and I choose what I think is the best one. And how do you decide what's best? Well, it has to be something that follows all the rules, and it has to be entertaining or interesting at least. So I chose the word mutter. And one feature of this competition these days is that when the reports changed to their current form, the people at the newspaper said, you must have a picture representing your word. And I thought, that makes it very difficult, actually, because there are some words, and it must be a stock image that we can buy off one of our stock image suppliers. And you think, okay, so if my answer is religion or something like that, how do I get a picture of religion? Sometimes you have to be very imaginative about the pictures. And there are some things like, if your answer is think, you end up with a cartoon think balloon or something like that as the picture. And I was looking through the dictionary, because I do this by selecting a bunch of dictionary pages and just finding a word that looks interesting. And I saw mutter, but in English, mutter is just a verb. And it just means you make this noise. I think you can't get a picture of that. And then I thought of this lady, Anne-Sophie Mutter, who was a German violin player. So she's the picture, and that meant that we could have mutter as the answer. And the winning clue goes like this. It says, parent who's one of a kind. Or that's what it seems to say. But what it's talking about is German translation, in which a parent, instead of a mother, is a Mutter, and a child isn't a child, but is a Kind, which we know in English from the word kindergarten, which is just German for children's garden. So it's really parent who's one of a kind. And that's a cryptic definition clue for Mutter, because that's German for one possible parent, and the German for father is Vater, V-A-T-E-R, so that can't be the answer. if you know that it's got 6 letters. So it's a perfectly fair clue, but I didn't think, it wasn't an idea that I'd ever seen before. So it was completely original and completely fair. So that's why it won. And then if you look through these reports, and you can get to this page, the URL there is very complicated, but if you just type, you don't need to match this capital letters here. If you match this, you just type that, the sundaytimes.co.uk/clue writing, you get to the index page, and that has links to about 500 different competitions or reports on competitions. And if we go back to, I'm going to change the report here, because the batch that you can see with the longer links are a bit non-standard in format, because we repeated some extra information that was added to the reports. This is the more typical kind. Oh, I've drawn on my screen. Right, so what you get is the winner. Then you will get a selection of clues that were nearly as good as the winner. And if you look through a particular report, that will give you all sorts of different ways of writing clues to the same word. And then after the really good clues, I have a section that I call some comments on other clues, which is either clues that were nearly very good, which applies to this first one that I talk about in this huge long paragraph, but they had one tiny flaw, as this one did. If this clue had one word different, it would have won the contest, but it had that one word wrong. And if it's a competition, you can't say, oh, never mind, we'll just change that one word. You have to take what people send you. And then you have some other clues that are much less satisfactory. So the people who've sent the clues that don't work have some chance of seeing their clue in the report, and some comments telling them why it doesn't work. Or if they don't see their clue, they might see a clue that's like theirs, or close enough to theirs for them to understand why their clue wasn't chosen or wasn't listed in the good clues. So that's a couple of online resources. Are there any more questions?
No, thank you. I think we're good. Yeah, well, we've got almost everyone. Most people. We've got 20 people left here, so just under 20. Okay, great. We've seen the entire crossword solved. We have heard your explanations for it. And I certainly had a good time. I enjoyed it. I hope you also enjoyed it. And thank you. Thank you for a fascinating evening, or in your case, afternoon.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'll send you a link to when I upload it. The recording.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. Really enjoyed it. It was great.
Good.
תודה, נהנו, ידעתי 8:30, כמו שחשבתי וידעתי.
Thank you very, very much. It was fascinating.
Okay.
Yeah, fascinating, interesting, and challenging, and inspiring, all of that.
I feel newly empowered to approach crossword puzzles now.
Well, have a
Okay,
go.
it's amazing. It's a very nice thing, very good thing, very good.
Okay. If Yuri has my email, and I still have a website kicking around.
I remember now, challenging and inspiring. That's what I was to say.
I have a website where I say to people that if they have a question about crosswords, I'm perfectly happy to answer it. And if Yuri tells you my email address for that purpose,
Sure.
I'm perfectly happy to answer any questions that you've got.
Great.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
Bye. Good
Thank you.
night.
Good night. Good evening. Goodbye. Bye. Goodbye. Bye. Bye.